Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this Shepherd Seminar, the third one for the year. For those who don't know, Shepherd Seminars are something we do here at the church, where we bring together people with various different types of expertise to think seriously about life, faith, and how that all fits together. Today I'm very pleased to have Deane Baker. Deane is an associate professor at UNSW Canberra. He's a specialist in military ethics and various topics around that. The format for this evening will be I'm going to chat to Deane for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for Q&A. There's two ways you'll be able to ask questions. There is a QR code and a Slido, if you want to leave that up, Deane, on the screen. So you can ask questions, start asking them now. Don't go easy on Deane, ask him the tough questions. Otherwise, at the end of there will be a mic coming around if you want to ask a question live when we get to that. So we'll get started. So Deane, I'm really interested in military ethics and war. Now, normally, war isn't something we really like to think about very much, and ethics tends to be one of those things for a lot of people that, we get given ethical puzzles at school that we kind of think about and prefer to forget. Why are you interested in both of them and coming together?
So I wasn't always a military ethicist. I don't think anyone as a little kid goes, that's what I want to be when I grow up. It sort of happened by accident. I spent a little bit of time in the military, the British Army and then the South African Army, very little bit of time. But then I kind of went back to university and I studied philosophy. I was an epistemologist. We can talk about that another day. It wasn't very useful to anybody, but it was fun. But I have ended up as a military ethicist, as you can see. So I even have a hat. I was going to bring it. It says military ethics on it, so I have a military ethics hat. I've written some books. But the way it sort of happened, I suppose the main person responsible is this guy. So do you want to recognize who that is? Danny Archer, right, from the movie Blood Diamond. But it's not him exactly. It's actually one of the guys in this picture, because as an undergraduate, I dated a nurse, and she had three brothers. One was a semi-professional rugby player. I should have asked who her brothers were before I asked her out. But he was a big hulking dude, and the second brother was, I'm not entirely sure, I think he was a gun smuggler, and the third was a special forces soldier, former special forces soldier, called Simon Witherspoon. And I met Simon, and I was scared of him because he was big and scary, but I ended up breaking up with that girlfriend, and life went on. But years later, I'm an academic at my university, and I turn on the TV, and there's this picture, and there's Simon. Simon is being arrested for his role in an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if anyone remembers that particular story. It was referred to as the Wonga coup, and involved Margaret Thatcher's son. So I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So I did what academics do. I organized a conference, right? So I do a conference about the ethics of mercenaries, and that's where it all started for me. That was my first book, which came out of that. I started working in that area. I finally twigged that my interest in the military and philosophy kind of smashed together around military ethics. And so I was then teaching at a university in South Africa, a civilian university, but got more and more into this military ethics thing. Ended up applying for a job at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. By some clerical error, they offered me the job. And so I taught there for a while in the Department of Leadership, Ethics and Law, and then got approached to come and teach for UNSW Canberra at ADFA, where my students are mostly trainee officers. So that's been kind of my main thing, but I've also, in recent years, obviously everyone's familiar with probably the Brereton Report, the Afghan inquiry, allegations of war crimes. As a consequence of that, I got pulled into doing some work for Special Operations Command, and that's been keeping me busy for the past 2 or 3 years. That's when most of my teaching has been focused. So it was a long-winded answer, but I had to go through this slide, so I'll stop there.
teaching ethics to members of Australian Defence Force Academy cadets, but also special operations soldiers. That sounds like a tough job, but kind of what do you teach them? What do you talk about? How do you go about? Well, does ethics look like for these people, and how do you go about teaching them that?
So, we all have our views about war and whether it's justified or isn't. So there are really these three main options, if you like, in thinking about the ethics of war. One is pacifism. Gandhi is often put forward as the archetype of a pacifist. And pacifists think that killing is just always wrong, that there are no situations when it's acceptable, and therefore war itself is wrong. The other extreme is the realist. So realists would say that, well, war is just necessary, and to try to apply ethics to it is a mistake. It's just not a space where ethics lives. There's war or there's ethics. You can't have them both. So pacifists and realists agree that you can't, that they share this view that you can't put ethics and war together. But really at the core of the military profession is the idea that you can, and that's the just war tradition. So that's really the heart of what we teach. It's got sort of these two parts to it. We can talk about these as we go, but the two traditional parts of the just war tradition are around when it's justified to go to war, so when war, excuse me, going backwards too fast. And then there's the question of how you conduct yourself within war. So that's someone made up some Latin terms. I always thought they were like these long historical things. They were made up in the 70s, right? But they sound cool. So it's the jus ad bellum, which is the justice of going to war, and the jus in bello, which is the ethics of your behavior within war. And there are some kind of frameworks around those. So the core of the jus ad bellum, people ask for ethical tools, so I just put pictures of tools and made this up. So there are the 6 principles of the jus ad bellum. Do you have a just cause? Are you the legitimate authority? Do you have right intention? Is it proportionate? Is it the last resort? And do you have likelihood of success? So we'll work through those. And then in bello has these main ideas of discrimination, proportionality, and necessity. And I'll just focus for a sec on that first one, discrimination, because it's really at the core of the profession. And we usually talk about it negatively, right? The principle of discrimination, or lawyers would say distinction, same thing, is about who is an appropriate target or a legitimate target in war. We generally talk about it negatively around those who are not legitimate targets. But actually, before it's that, it's a permission. Within the just war tradition, soldiers have a permission to kill enemy combatants under the right circumstances. And that's really the core of the profession in some ways. And so we spend a lot of time kind of pulling that apart. And we also try to tie it into general ethical theories and try and show how these things kind of match up and connect up. So, you've got the traditional approaches to ethics, deontological or rule-based approaches, consequentialist approaches, and then your virtue approaches, so around character. So that's roughly, there you go, you've done my course now. But that's very much the kind of broad overview of what we try to teach.
So I guess kind of a follow-up question to that in terms of things like discrimination and trying to think through these ethical constraints or aspects to war. There's a strain of thought, and you hear it around Afghanistan and things, but isn't that just kind of handcuffing us? Does that mean that we can't actually win the war? How does that strain of thinking, and is that common among the people you teach?
It's not common, but it's something that I certainly do hear. And there's an understandable frustration. Why are we limiting ourselves and limiting the way we use force when the enemy doesn't care at all? The easy answer to that is because we're not them and we don't want to be them. That's pretty straightforward. And I think often that frustration also comes out of perhaps a lack of awareness of just quite how flexible these principles are. And I don't mean that in a kind of negative sense of your ethics are a bit flexible. But rather that they are capable of addressing quite a very wide range of circumstances and adjusting your understanding of what's appropriate in those circumstances. So, going from peacekeeping to high-end conventional combat, those same principles are very applicable all the way through. But I think some people feel like that they only see them at that low end, and they don't see how they can potentially apply and still be useful in kind of more intense situations, if you like.
Now, I'm interested in one question you have on the screen, particularly around the character, the kind of value ethics. That, the question there is, what will this do to my character, is something I think probably we don't think much about in terms of ethics and ethics of war and ethics for soldiers.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about kind of why that's there and kind of what impact that has?
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. So, the character thing, it's not really built into the just war tradition, but it is very much built into the way militaries have historically dealt with ethics. That who you were was really the defining feature. It's about being the right kind of a soldier. Particularly in Britain, for example, the regimental system, that's what your embodiment of your values and that character that you were supposed to take on and absorb. So militaries have long been advocates for characters being a fundamental part of it, and I think that's right. It's just that it hasn't always been that well connected up with the other parts, but the character part is really, it's a very ancient way of thinking about ethics. So Aristotle is the most kind of well-known virtue ethicist or character ethicist. He's been dead quite a while, but he was right about a lot of stuff, right? And contemporary psychology and contemporary research is kind of showing that. And this is not the Chief of Air Force, the Canadian Armed Forces ethics decision-making model. But it reflects, some of you will be familiar with this slow and fast thinking idea, that there's different ways of thinking. And when it's slow thinking, that's where we stop and we work through a problem and then reach our conclusion. But actually, most of our decisions are fast. We just react on instinct. And that's where character is so fundamental. Right? Having formed the habits of behavior that enable you to do the right thing when you don't have time to stop and think it through, that's where character is. It's also key because unlike philosophers like me, in the real world, military ethics is not an exercise in sitting and thinking around. And you're doing things where you're facing a whole range of tests and challenges that kind of erode our ability to make the right decision. So it might be a situation where under normal, if we were sitting and doing it in a classroom and reading the case study, it would be pretty obvious what the right thing to do was, right? But under the kinds of pressures that soldiers face in the field, there are all sorts of things that kind of block your ability to go down that path. And so we talk about some of them being cognitive risk factors. Obvious ones would be fatigue, surprise. If we take by surprise, we react and usually not in a good way. And there are a range of those kinds of factors that can influence our thinking. But also the fact that we are social animals is so fundamental that the way the group reacts to things is very influential on our behavior and on our decision making. Even when, if we're in another situation, we didn't know what the right thing to do was. Put us in a group where everybody else is doing the other thing, and we're much more likely to do that. So one of the stories I used to illustrate this is the Planet of the Apes, the original movie of the Planet of the Apes. Charlton Heston writes about this in his autobiography, where it's day one of filming, and they've got all these extras to come together, and they all arrive. Nobody knows anybody else, they're all volunteers. They get put into makeup and they put on their costumes, and they're randomly given either a gorilla costume or a chimpanzee costume, and they're dressed up. And filming starts, they get to the first coffee break, they break for coffee, and all the chimpanzees go and have coffee together, and all the gorillas go. And that's fundamentally what we're like. Right? We are just fundamentally herd animals. And so these are important factors that we need to recognize that can influence our ethical decision making. Even when we would otherwise know what the right thing to do is, we might still not do the right thing.
So I'm going to jump to one question that's coming online and then kind of get back to the scheduled program. So countries invest in asymmetric war fighting, cyber, drone swarms, which often risk civilians, and I think risks to civilians are increasing. Any thoughts there on what the balance in those contexts are between kind of the ethics of war and winning?
Yeah, really good. Great question. So, I mentioned historically we've got this kind of two parts to the just war tradition. You use ad bellum, when's it justifiable to go to war, and then how do you fight when it's a war. But often the situations we're facing today don't comfortably fit into that category. And so the scholars are starting to think about different categories. There's this idea of jus ad vin, the justice of using force short of war, and how do you think about that? But broadly speaking, the same principles apply. That the idea of, and if you want to, for me, the easiest way to think about the just war tradition is it's recognizing two things. One is that war is terrible. Right? People get killed, things get broken. War is awful. It's a terrible, terrible thing. The other hand, the just war tradition takes that sometimes war is just. It is an appropriate response to certain circumstances. So sometimes it's necessary. And the just war tradition is a set of principles, very pragmatic, not kind of deeply theorized, that tries to walk a path that tries to balance those two things. So if you open up the aperture too much and allow too many kinds of actions or allow too wide a range of targets, the terribleness of war gets out of hand. It's too much. But on the other hand, if you narrow it too much, then war is just, you can't do it. And that wars that should be fought are not fought. And so that tension is really at the core of the tradition. And when we get to asymmetric warfare and so on, it's the same thing. We're trying to work our way through it and go, okay, is this too terrible? Are we allowing too much here? Because yes, maybe it's acceptable, you're allowed to do this, but are you opening that aperture too far? And with cyber, for example, it just raises questions that we've never thought about, or we never had to think about in the history of war, because war was really about killing people, right? Well, with cyber, it's not necessary. It can be. Cyber attacks can be lethal. But those are the simple ones, because then we can just apply the framework in the usual kind of way. But what about when we're talking about doing significant harm to people, but it's not lethal harm? Is it the same? Can you inflict some harm on non-combatants to achieve an effect? How much harm? And that's where it gets quite difficult. But it really is very situational to the specific end. What are you trying to achieve? Are those ends justifiable? And how do you keep the constraints in play while still allowing action? I think I talked around the question.
So keen to get to the title of this seminar is War, Ethics and Faith, and keen to get to the kind of faith part of that now. So, what does all this mean for Christians? Is it ethical for Christians to go to war, given, Jesus said to turn the other cheek? And if we are involved in a war situations, what are the kind of, at least your view, expectations on Christians, how we should act? Should we be acting differently to everyone else?
Okay, great. So there are certainly Christians who are pacifists, and that's a very defensible position. The just war tradition, though, comes out of, at least in the West, there are parallels in other cultures, but the just war tradition really comes out of its origin for us comes out of a time when St. Augustine was wrestling with this particular question. So in, I was trying to remember this earlier, 410 AD, Rome was sacked by the Goths, not the ones with the makeup, the scary ones. And this was just unfathomable for the people of Rome. Rome was, the great civilization of the day. Everything that worked, everything that was good about the world came out of Rome. So Rome was terrible in lots of ways, right? It was oppressive and awful, but Rome had been sacked. And so the Romans were looking for a scapegoat. And the nearest scapegoat for them were the Christians, because the Christians have quite recently been sort of accepted into society, not accepted, but they stopped burning them, which was nice, and they were allowed to have their churches. But the people of Rome at the time were like, well, this is clearly what's gone wrong. The reason Rome has been sacked by these gods is that we've turned to the wrong gods. We've allowed this Christian God to come in, and so we've been punished by the other gods. And so Augustine, who's a fellow African, the other end, he writes this book in response to this, right? But he's also dealing with the situation, because at the time, the Christians were pacifists. They refused to fight in the battle to try to stay off the attackers. And this was also one of the things that caused great unhappiness amongst the Romans. So Augustine wrestles with this, and he goes, okay, look, he writes loads about how the Romans are wrong, and the true God is the Christian God, and that's all the best stuff of the book. But he also deals with this question of, is it okay for Christians to fight? And he says, well, war is not the worst of things, right? That there are some things that are worse than war. War is terrible, unquestionably. But some kinds of injustice are worse than that. And so, and he also takes this view that the prince, then it would be Caesar, the ruler, has a God-ordained role to provide safety and security. It's not perfect. It's this. He talks about the city of man, right? The city of man is corrupt and idolatrous, not good in lots of ways, but it's still a lot better than chaos. And so he comes to the conclusion that it is acceptable for Christians to fight, as long as they fight with the right motives and in the right kinds of circumstances, where it's for the appropriate authority, it's fighting against some kind of injustice, and where, in a way, it's dealing with the sin of the attacker. It's almost how he puts it. But, so out of that has come this tradition. Now, not everyone buys it. I think that's probably about right. So, there are things we find in the New Testament. For example, various soldiers who get spoken to by the Christians, they don't tell them to stop being soldiers. Right? That's never part of the narrative. So there is a suggestion that there's a hint there that it's acceptable. But that's the framework, and it's a very, very rich and powerful framework for us. And in a way, it's Augustine recognizing, and those who came after him, that we live in an imperfect, fallen world. We can be idealistic, and that's an option, but that's often going to lead to injustice. Would we be happy, for example, to just accept Hitler and the Nazis? No, most people think that was a just war, and that was the right thing to do. And most Christians, I think, would agree with that as well. So I think coming in terms of thinking about it as a Christian, what's your role in this? If you're involved or if you're drawn in. I think the key is to really get to grips with the tradition, the just war tradition, and understand what those parameters are. Because I think they do give a leeway, a permission to fight, but it's very tightly constrained in order to as far as possible, minimize the horribleness of it.
So we've got a follow-up question on that. In terms of, you mentioned briefly before about there being equivalent or similar kind of questions outside the Western tradition. So how widely recognised is the just war tradition outside the Christian or post-Christian West? Are there equivalent traditions? And I'd also be interested in thoughts on kind of, does this shift to a post-Christian kind of society, is that changing it?
So the Western Christian tradition is by far the dominant version of this, but there is a fairly strong strand within Islamic jurisprudence that touches on a lot of the same ideas. You find it in Hindu thought. So most traditions have some guidelines about what is appropriate, and they're not that different when you look at them. Right? Now, it's a lot less systematized in most of those other traditions, and I'm certainly not an expert in those. But they're out there. In terms of how recognized it is, in a sense, international humanitarian law, or the law of war as we have it today, is largely an embodiment of the principles of the just war tradition. Mostly around the use in bello, so the question of how to fight. There's less of it built in terms of the use ad bellum, although now we have the International Criminal Courts of crime preparation, which reflects that principle of just cause, right? The just war tradition of just cause. So it's really the, if you like, the philosophical basis for international law around the use of force that we have today. And we talk, so you may well hear some people talk about just war theory. I've done that myself in the past. I repent of it. And part of the reason is because although it has some generally accepted principles, it's still a tradition. It's always evolving. It's always adjusting to new circumstances. And that tradition, while it starts very strongly in Christendom as it was then, so Aquinas was important as well. It does become secularized over time, and that's how it becomes the basis for the laws we have. Does it lose some of its impetus? Possibly. So there's an underlying question: why? Right? Why should we care about the terribleness of war if it's not happening to us? The Christian tradition gives you a clear answer to that. If you secularize it, it's maybe harder to get that answer, but it's still pretty powerful, and it's a really useful framework.
Now, I think we all here hope we never have to face war ourselves, even people in the Defence Force in Australia. You train in case you have to go to war, not you train to go to war. Is there anything that we can learn from this kind of military ethics and the things you're talking about for our jobs or our daily lives, or the things we are likely and we prefer to face?
I actually think it's a great framework for any time you're trying to make a decision that's going to cause harm to somebody else. It's not what it was designed. It's designed specifically for war, but back to that. Principles. So think about these principles, right? You're going to do something. You foresee that it's going to cause harm to somebody. Should you do it or not? Well, do I have just cause? Is there a good reason to do this? Am I the right person to do it? Am I the legitimate authority? Am I the person who should be doing this at all? What are my intentions? Do I have good intentions? Or am I using some kind of right to give me an excuse to do something that's harming someone? Is it proportionate? So those first three are really principle-based requirements. So we're asking, do I have the right? But the second three say, well, I may have the right, but I've got to consider what the implications of this would be. Should I actually exercise this right that I have? So is it proportionate? I'm going to cause this harm to this person. Is that harm actually beyond what's justified by me achieving the end that I'm wanting to achieve? Is there something else I could do? Is there some way to avoid this altogether? Then I should do that. If I can avoid harming somebody, I should do that. And likelihood of success, am I going to harm somebody and it's going to have no impact at all? In which case, why did I just harm somebody? So they're just great questions, actually. I think they're really useful. And when you come into the, it's because it's upside down, to the actual thing, again, are you directing this at the right person? Is the right person being harmed? Again, that question of proportionality and necessity, you can talk through that in the military context. But I think they're great questions to ask for lots of situations. So it doesn't answer everything, but it's a useful framework.
So I'll jump to, there's a question here, but I'm kind of interested in kind of how, given your training, particularly AD for cadets, I'll get to the question in a sec, kind of how do they respond to these? I mean, I noticed that this is a probably more rigorous and structured way of thinking through ethical decision making than I've come across in other workplaces? Is it something they warm to, or is it something that's like, yeah, I don't need to worry about that?
It's on the whole, the students respond very positively to it. You always get a few who are like, I don't care about this. I just want to go out and kick indoors. Fair enough. I mean, you've got to remember our students are just out of high school and then they started but they haven't had any of that real world experience. And I find that when I teach to older and more experienced soldiers, they're much more receptive simply because they've been in situations where it's been, wow, what do I do? What's the right thing to do here? They've seen the necessity for these frameworks, and so they're more naturally responsive to it. But I'm certainly not going to be down on our advert training officers. They're bright and they're engaged, and most students they're great. We also have a handful of core engineering students, like Shrek was, who has had to sit through this, but they tolerate me, so it's good.
So on the kind of advocate desk, but also possibly talking about some of the more experienced, how are they feeling about things like the Brereton inquiry in Afghanistan, and do they see it as potential that they'll be prosecuted for doing their job, or kind of what impact does that have?
It's been an interesting few years just with the Brereton report in the background. So I wasn't involved in the report in any kind of way. My involvement has been really in the response, in thinking about how we can try to prevent things like that happening in the future, more education and so on. And my sense is that most people, almost everybody I've spoken to, recognizes the need to respond to it. I think there's frustration often in that it's a big bureaucracy trying to respond in various ways. Bureaucracies are not great at dealing with things as nuanced as ethics. Sometimes there's frustrations around that. But I think on the whole, most people are quite positive about needing to respond to it. And I don't know anyone whose worldview has changed because they now realize they might be prosecuted. I think they knew that before. Right? But in many ways, it's a very healthy thing that it's come to light. So it's not. It seems like an odd thing to say that it's something we should be proud of. And clearly, we should be proud of the events that triggered it. But in having a real inquiry and bringing, we now have the first person who's been charged with a war crime. That is very, very, very unusual in world terms. And we weren't the only nation engaged in Afghanistan. And I would be very, very, very surprised if we were the only nation that wasn't responsible for some illegal killings. But we're the only ones that have had anything like this level of response. So it's something in a way to be proud of, as much as it's an awkward and awful thing. And I think most people get that. Sometimes it's, you've got to show up at this time, you've got to get the mandatory ethics talk. You get it, right? No one wants the mandatory training. I don't really get this. So there's a little bit of resistance from that sometimes. But on the whole, I think it's been a good response.
Okay. So happy to open up for questions if you want to flip through the last slide. So if people either stick your hand up and Lara will come around the microphone, and there's a couple more coming in on the, but I'll ask one from here, and then if you want to start wandering around. So we'll start with the one end. What are your views on mandatory national service and more widespread participation in the military, even if it's on a short-term basis?
Great question. Conscription. So I grew up in South Africa where we had conscription at the time. I managed to dodge it in a legal way, which is nice. The problem with conscription is its force. Right? If you have to go, and that really undermines one of the fundamental ideas of the just war tradition, which is what's sometimes referred to as the moral equality of combatants. And it's this idea that if you're in the military and you're deployed somewhere and you're in a war and you go and kill somebody, you don't necessarily do something wrong in that. Even if it turns out example of this where they really used it as a tool in nation building and built a real identity from that. Other countries as well. I wouldn't say it's always a bad idea, but I think we have to be conscious of that issue of consent. It's really quite important in justification for it.
Okay. Thanks, Dean. I always think that I have with just war is that often for soldiers to feel comfortable in war, they either have to justify themselves or dehumanize the enemy. And you've already mentioned like this is kind of like us and them, with them being like you don't want to become like them. And so I guess my question is for you is how do you reconcile for yourself just war and Jesus' command to love your enemies?
Great question. So let me pick up on that dehumanization thing. I think that's really important. There's a tension at the heart of that, in the sense that for your normal human being to go onto a battlefield and kill another human being is an incredibly difficult thing to ask for them, right? And one of the techniques that militaries use is a kind of dehumanization, that you objectify the enemy, so they become targets, they become objectives, right? They know other people. Because if you're looking down your scope at an enemy and you're thinking about them as a human being with family and friends and dreams and hopes, it's going to be almost impossible to do the job that you're there to do. So, as awkward as that sounds, some kind of dehumanization is necessary, but the wrong kind of dehumanization can be terrible. And this is what sometimes does happen, where it's not an objectification, where it's a kind of animalistic dehumanization, where the enemy becomes treated as if they are less than human. So the classic example of this was the Rwanda genocide, right? So one of the key elements in that genocide was the constant refrain that came over the radio stations, information warfare. Again and again, they are cockroaches, they are cockroaches, they are cockroaches. If you can convince people that their neighbors are cockroaches, much easier for them to pick up machetes and hack them to death, right? Which is awful, right? So that objectification is important to enable people to do their job, but we've got to make sure it doesn't become that kind of dehumanization, that animalistic dehumanization. And one of the things that I try to stress in my teaching is we need to teach people to have mechanisms to switch back on their humanity. Whatever it is for you as depending on your role. Again, I deal a lot with special forces, who I have been recently. I said to them, think of what it's going to be. Is it that moment where you flip the safety switch back on the rifle? At that moment you're going, okay, now these are human beings and some of them need my help. That's what you actually have to do. And that's a very hard transition for us to do. In terms of loving your enemies, this is something that obviously Augustine wrestled with. And I'm going to try and do Augustine because it's hard. But essentially, yeah, his view is, well, killing someone's not the worst thing we can do. Stopping someone from sinning, that can trump it. Now that's an interesting argument. I'm not saying that that's what we're doing all the time. But part of it also for him is it's about the intention. And this is quite fundamental. What is behind the intention behind the action? Is your intention to kill that person? That's problematic. Is your intention to stop them doing what they're doing, to stop them being combat effective? Well, that's okay. And if you kill them as a byproduct, that's unfortunate. Some would argue that's a kind of hair-splitting thing, but it's trying to get at that kind of fundamental, what's in your heart. That's obviously been a bit lost. As we secularize it, can't have international humanitarian law asking what's in your heart. But we do still think about people's intentions.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions about atomic weapons and nuclear war. So one, has the threat of nuclear war changed the attitude to just war? And two, the classic was the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, we feel justified.
Are there any Americans in the room? I can't speak for you. so interestingly, the just war tradition in the West was more or less kind of disappeared from academia. It was really the Catholic bishops who kept it alive, and particularly they had a conference of Catholic bishops around the nuclear war. So it was really important in keeping this tradition going. So come to the question of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let me bounce back again if I can do that. So this is the framework for deciding whether an act is justified or not. Is it discriminate, or is it targeting the right people? Is it proportionate? Does the amount of harm you're doing, is it fit to the objective, the reasonable objective that you're trying to achieve? And is it necessary? Is there some other way that you could achieve this aim? So, what do you think? Throw it back in. Was it discriminate? No, it's deliberately targeted at non-combatants. Fails the first test, right? So in terms of the traditional, the just war tradition, the nuclear bombs just can't be justified. They're almost always attempted, those who argue for them, attempt to justify them on a kind of utilitarian grounds. That we weigh up, well, yes, that was bad, but if we had to invade the Japanese islands, more people would have died in those bombs. It stopped the war. So overall, we balance it out, and it's good. And there's questions about that argument. Last time I looked at Japan as a collection of islands. We had, control of the seas. Did we really have to invade? So there are questions you can ask about that, but I think it's pretty questionable. I think one thing we forget though, it wasn't that different to what was happening before, right? So the firebombing of Tokyo, about 100,000 people killed in that one. It's firebombing. We're deliberately trying to set the city alight. We're not trying to discriminatingly target military targets. It happened in Germany, bombed Dresden, bombed many German cities. At that point in that war, the rules had kind of gone out of control, right? And I think that's an important thing to remember about war, that this is the tendency of wars, that as they go on, the constraints tend to get looser and looser and looser. That's not, the just war tradition doesn't justify that, that's the way wars tend to happen. So it's not good.
So picking up on that kind of way you up there, there's a question here that if a military compromises their ethics somewhat to prevent a more unethical future, which people may well argue happened in World War II, does that or can that improve the kind of aggregate social welfare, or kind of does it make things better than justifiable? Didn't ask me.
Yes, please.
So if the military compromises their ethics somewhat to prevent a more unethical future,
I would kind of say no to that, actually. I'm not. So the military, are we compromising our ethics, or are we trying to do things ethically? And recognizing that in a perfect world, that doing the ethical thing is often not particularly clean. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're compromising your ethics. You're simply recognizing that the only ethical route here is ideally messy, that we need, in these circumstances, we have to go over there and kill those people, or try to stop them in ways that are likely to their death. I'm not sure that's compromise. I think that's reality. So yeah, maybe I just don't agree with the premise of the question.
okay. Well, we'll move to another one then. Given the kind of just war tradition you're talking about, how does it speak to supporting war efforts internationally, either offensively or defensively, when you're not directly harmed?
Yeah.
So, Australia and Ukraine is a
Good question.
example.
So the tradition is, and really the UNSW decision, do we get involved? You've got to meet all of the conditions, but the most important one, the weightiest one, is that just cause. And what is a just cause? Traditionally, there have been a fairly wide range that were acceptable as just causes. So Augustine felt punishing wrongdoing was an appropriate cause for war. We don't think that anymore. There were times when it was felt that protecting or defending your country's honour was a just cause for war. We don't think that anymore. We've really come down to one, and that is defence against aggression. That is the only, mostly uncontroversial, of course there's some philosophy against that, there's always a philosopher obviously against anything, but most would accept that, okay, defence against aggression is the just cause. That is extended also though to helping others defend against aggression. So think of the domestic analogy. Someone who gets attacked in the street by some mugger, they have the right to defend themselves. No one thinks that they're doing anything wrong if they proportionately defend themselves. But no one also thinks you're doing anything wrong if you go to help them to defend themselves. And that's the principle that's embedded there. So it is appropriate and it's acceptable to come to the aid of others. It gets complicated when you do that because your just cause may not be exactly the same as their just cause. You've got to be very careful about your intentions. Are your intentions appropriate? What are you trying to get out of this? But it is acceptable.
Okay.
Can I ask, I've got the mic so I can ask a kind of similar question to that in terms of civil war, and first of all civil war in that second thing in terms of the legitimate authority, but also then other countries intervening in a civil war. What's your thoughts on that?
That's a really tricky one. Thank you for asking that. So there is a long tradition within the just war corpus of thinking about this, and there's if you kind of took a poll, I suppose, of leading thinkers, most of them would say rebellion against the state is not acceptable, which is not something we're naturally comfortable with today. But the idea there is, and if you go back again to the early days around Augustine, well, they had this view that kings were put in place by God, even if they were terrible kings, and so it wasn't for us to overthrow them. As it gets secularized, it becomes more of a consequentialist viewpoint that yes, tyranny is bad, but chaos is worse. Chaos is the worst of things. It's better to have people living under a tyrant than to have a civil war and have chaos. And if you think of civil wars in recent times, think of Libya, let's say Libya today. Years after we helped them overthrow Gaddafi, it's still a basket of chaos. People are still suffering. So they have a point. But nonetheless, I think that today most people would say that there are circumstances in which it's justified to for someone who isn't a legitimate authority in the legal sense to take up arms, and so in my historical context, think of the fight against apartheid, regime, the African National Congress, in Contour-C's way was their military arm. Most scholars would agree that they had a right to fight because they had a kind of legitimacy that came from representing a group of people who have been treated extremely badly. But there's a threshold there. It's got to be really, really bad. And you've got to have, the alternate routes and so on. So because of that problem, tyranny is bad, but chaos is often worse.
So there's a question at the back, but while we're going there, following up from that, quick question here. That you may have just answered, you may not. If you were there, would you have tried to help one off that killed people?
Yes. I think so. I think it's a legitimate target because the head of state, because of the situation of war, and yeah. So yes, while rebellion is usually bad, some kinds of tyranny I think are justified.
Dean, thank you so much for this evening. It's been fantastic. I have one simple question for you. Will an eye for an eye leave the whole world blind?
Yes. So look, it's a great question, and so something I didn't mention, I probably should have mentioned this about the just war tradition, is it's framed in this kind of viewpoint that the only justified purpose for war is a better peace. And those kind of principles, those constraints, are supposed to be a way to try to ensure that that's what we're trying to get at. So an eye for an eye is vengeance, right? So vengeance is not now considered a justification within war, or within the just war tradition. And it's one we feel quite uncomfortable with in the West. Actually, not everybody does, right? So I've been in situations with people from other countries describing missions that they did, and very blatantly, overtly saying this was about vengeance. It was they'd done something to us, and we were going to get them back. We maybe sometimes think that way, but we try to kind of reframe it because we do recognize there's something problematic about that. The problem with that is, where does it ever end? Right? I get my revenge on you, then your family gets their revenge on my family, and it may never stop. So that end goal of are we going to do this? Are we going to get a better peace out of this? And that's one of the reasons. I try to encourage my students to have that in their mind. When you're doing this, are you making it harder to reach a peace with these people at the end? Then think very hard about this. Ultimately, you're going to have to make peace with them. So that's going to be a fundamental thing in the back of the mind.
So, following on from that, there's a question here that in the 20th century we saw lots of wars based on ideology, which groups use the kind of ideologies, the just cause or justification. How should we deliberate and think about proportionality when it's kind of unclear whether there is a just cause or...
So the ideology, so going to war for an ideology, it's hard to justify. It certainly has happened, right? We were saying, and when you're doing that, it's usually a kind of consequentialist calculation. Okay, the world will be better if my ideology is the dominant. It's good for everybody, and so we do something that. And it's not just the other guys that do this. So, in the West, if you think back to, for example, the invasion of Iraq, this is what some scholars have just called the liberal crusade. Right? That there was this idea that invading Iraq would allow us to create a Jeffersonian democracy in the Middle East, and this was ideological. This was driving what we did, and it was a really bad idea. Right? It didn't work well, but it was the wrong kind of motivation. So, ideologies shouldn't be the driving thing. It should. That's why we've constrained it down in law and in the tradition to defense against aggression. Defense against aggression. Again and again. That's what justifies it. There are lots of wars that are unjust on both sides, right? But not both sides can't be just. That's clear. This is the last bit.
The last bit was, what does that mean if you think about proportionality and other aspects of your purpose?
Yeah, so again, if you're, I don't think you can even start thinking about proportionality. If your just cause is wrong, no kind of harm is justified according to the wrong kind of just cause. So if it's self-defense, then we can talk about proportionality in the kind of way.
So another question here we have: what does the just war tradition typically say about whether a country should intervene against a country that oppresses its own citizens? So responsibility to protect.
Yeah. So that's the phrase that's referred to. And this is quite a new debate. I mean, it's obviously been something that's been talked about for a long time, but you remember Gareth Evans, current Foreign Minister? He was a key figure in all of this. There was this international debate around, and it really kind of came out after the Rwandan genocide, was this idea, hold on, surely somebody should have done something. And surely there was a responsibility to be involved. Traditionally, though, really since the Treaties of Westphalia, we've had this very strong idea of state sovereignty, that states, what they do inside their borders is up to them, and everyone should leave each other alone, and the world's going to be a better place because of that. And that came out of a history of states just getting into each other's business because of you are oppressing So you had the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War, kind of went on a bit. And I mean, those were the worst wars of European history up to that point. So the Peace of Westphalia, the treaties that came out of that, made this point, right? Okay, state sovereignty. What happens within your borders is up to you. You just don't mess with us. And we've had a strong norm. With the Rwanda genocide came a resurgence of this idea that maybe there are situations in which it's appropriate for us to get involved. And if you go back to the idea of the just cause, where just cause is defense, is self-defense, it's a kind of extension of that idea of defense of others. But the scholars who write about it, most would argue it's only in extreme situations. Again, because the effects of these things tend to get out of hand. You tend to cause more trouble than you're trying to fix, and it gets worse and worse. So Michael also uses this phrase, situations that shock the conscience of humanity. That's the test for when you can get involved and intervene in another country militarily.
From a Christian point of view, I was just thinking about the opposite of the enemies, but loving our neighbours, and the example you gave of walking down the street at night and seeing someone get mugged and wanting to go and intervene and help. Does that sort of apply in that situation where something is so bad, like Rwanda, where we should have, it is loving our neighbour to intervene in that and getting involved?
It is, and I suppose the constraint is really, the loving the neighbour gives you the right, but the constraint is on, hold on, what are the effects it's going to be? Will it actually be worse? Because if we start, at the international level, start getting involved in, people would say, Myanmar today, for example, why aren't we getting involved there? Where does this end? Are we now responsible for every country, and do we just break the system? And that would be much worse than the terribleness that is happening in Myanmar. So that's the challenge. It's about weighing the right against the consequences and trying to make that.
And we address that with aid, I think. There's a nice, like a kind of, instead of always assuming it has to be force, that there are other things you can do around aid.
Yeah, so if you can deal with it without using force, then absolutely that's the right thing to do.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. Just thinking through the kind of world context at the moment with US-China competition and the very different Chinese tradition thinking about war with like a premise in the art of war is you win the war without direct conflict or combat through other coercive measures that might do as much harm. How do we contend with, I guess, a very different ethical framework?
It's a great question, and I think what you put your finger on is we often presume the adversaries do things in the same kind of way as we do about these things, and that's where things often go very wrong. So, I mean, in a way, this comes back to that point early on about what we're talking about there is something that's not war but requires a robust response. How do we, again, still treading that fine line between the terribleness of things that we could do and the necessity of them? I think the framework still applies. I just think we haven't always worked out what that means in specific situations. And there is some interesting work coming out on that, on the ethics of information warfare and that kind of thing. But yes, that it does make it much more difficult too, because you don't know what it is you're doing. And this idea of so what one scholar says, if we don't have a line between the ethics of war and the ethics of everything else, then either everything is war or everything is peace. Neither of those is true, right? So we do have to have a way to draw lines and say, okay, this applies here. I think the same principles apply, but we need to have appropriate limits. That's very helpful.
Maybe that's your next one.
Who's training the enlisted men who actually do the killing?
It's a good question. So, and traditionally it's been the officers who get all the training in ethics, and that's a massive oversight. So if you think of the people who've been in the news who are accused of these acts, both of them are NCOs, and almost certainly didn't have any kind of formal ethics training before the events that they're accused of. Now they would have got some law of armed conflict training. Those briefings can be briefings. So I think you're right. You're pointing to a big gap. The good news from the ADF side is I'm definitely seeing that change. So Army rolled out a package, an ethical armouring package for everybody to do. So there's definitely an appetite for spreading this far and wide and making sure people are better equipped. But I think there's work to be done.
So I've got one more question here online, and then there's time for one or two more for people in the audience. So our assumption is not all wars are justified. So what if the state, presumably engages in an unjustified war? How would you reconcile Christian ethics in such a situation? What would you do?
What would I do?
Oh.
Yeah.
What should
you do? Yes, thanks for not making fun. No one's going to send you to war. That would be terrible. So that's a great, it's a really important issue, and so this is where we come up against the idea of conscientious objection. Historically, that has been focused on objection to conscription. So in South Africa, you had the conscription campaign. You had people, including Christians, probably knows one who went to jail because he refused to serve and suffered very badly as a result. And that's a very justifiable option, right? Christians are entitled, if it's an unjust cause, as is anybody else, to choose not to fight. But it comes at a cost. Often you're going to be potentially jailed, certainly ostracized. And so and this is a thing about ethics in general. Ethics really only kicks in when it hurts. Doing the right thing when it's easy, is that ethics really? Ethics is often painful. Doing the right thing is often going to be costly. But I think that's just the reality. And so certainly there may well be situations in which Christians should say, I can't go and do this, and bear the cost of that. But there is a kind of interesting, it's a small debate in the literature about what's called selective conscientious objection. So generally conscientious objection is about objecting to serving in the military. Someone who's a pacifist saying, I don't want to do that. But this idea of selective, of being able to choose. The problem with it, of course, is if we make a law that you can opt out, which some have argued, what are the implications of that for your armed forces? If, say, I mean, people, in the ADF are volunteers. They volunteer to be in the military, but they haven't necessarily volunteered to go to this war to fight against these people. If we made a law that they could say, sorry, I'm not comfortable with this, I'm going to opt out, what does that do to your military effectiveness? So there is a consequence to this thing that has to be weighed against it. On the other hand, do you want to go to war with people who don't want to be there? How effectively?
I'll put another one through. So thinking about intelligent machines, AI, and like what that means to war, is it a solution to wage war justifiably to create intelligent machines that can discriminate and target and increase the likelihood of success?
So I read a little book on this. It's called Should We Ban Killer Robots? So it's a big hot topic of debate. The UN has been debating they just kind of wrapped it up recently, but for about 10 years, should we ban killer robots? And they couldn't come to a conclusion. And there are a number of objections to autonomous weapons, as more properly called. One of the obvious objections is, can we really rely on them to make those distinctions, right? Can we trust a machine to identify a combatant versus a non-combatant? So we've just done some experimentation at ADFA with our training officers, and we've got an AI system that a company in Brisbane makes, and we set up some scenarios. And basically, it's not an autonomous weapon, but what it does is it puts on the screen a little box around the person that says they've got a uniform on, they're carrying a weapon, their hands are not up, they're not surrendering, and some information about that. And the idea is to help you to make quicker decisions on the battlefield. But what if it's wrong? So we set up a situation where we deliberately made it so that the AI misidentified the person as a combatant, and to see whether people would make good decisions. Well, we haven't done all the number crunching yet, but they don't make good decisions. So another question is a machine better than us? So is putting a human on the loop actually improving things? If we just, in the end, follow what the machine recommends, are we actually improving anything at all? But there is also a kind of fundamental question, and this is the issue that the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy See, has really emphasized. So they've called autonomous weapons means mala and secta, means of war that are evil in themselves, wrong in themselves. And the fundamental objection that they have is that they would say that allowing a computer, an AI, to decide whether a human lives or dies is a fundamental violation of that human's dignity. And that should mean that it shouldn't be allowed. I have my views about that, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So we've got another AI question on the line here. So again, AI, how will that affect the ethics of war, considering not all data used to train AI systems is unbiased? Anything there?
It comes down to, all boils down to the discrimination and proportionality question. Can we trust it to be sufficiently accurate? And if the answer is no, then we shouldn't use it. And that's in a way a moving target, because the capabilities are going to get more and more sophisticated, so then there might be circumstances where we can use that system. And it's also contextual, so think about the difference between, for example, a subsurface submarine hunter, an autonomous submarine hunter. Not a lot of civilians out there, right? Not a lot of civilian submarines. What's that one, that tragic one? Titanic, but anyway, that's not there anymore. So you don't have too many civilians to be concerned about. So it's a kind of a safe environment to allow the AI to make decisions. On the other hand, if you are going into a crowded city where there are heaps of civilians wandering around, we may not want to trust the AI. So there's a kind of moving question about context and capability, and it's going to keep on changing. But I think there are circumstances where we can say it's acceptable.
That was basically my question.
Okay.
It's more like if you fight an adversary that doesn't, if you are the people that decide, no, we're not going to fight with AI, versus an adversary that does decide, we're fighting every facet of warfare with AI, there's no way we win that.
Yeah. Right. So there's a level of pragmatism. Now there are some kinds of things we still would choose never to do. We should still choose never to do, right? Regardless of whether the adversary is willing to do it. So torture is a good example. We have many adversaries who are more than happy to use torture, and maybe that gives them some kind of an advantage over us. I don't know, probably not, but let's imagine it does. We would still want to say that's a line we're going to draw. So there are some lines where we just hard and fast lines, right? We will not be budged on this, but we have to be sure we have the line right with the right reasons for it. And my view is I think that autonomous systems in the right circumstances would be okay. And I suppose it comes back to that issue of, and people are very divided on this issue of the human dignity. Some people don't see it as an issue at all. I think one way to think about it is, look, again, this tradition we have is a pragmatic compromise around very messy situations. Is someone's dignity potentially being violated sufficiently robust a thing to restrict us in using the there'll be situations, for example, so often these systems are optionally autonomous. Right? You can either remotely pilot it or you can set it off and it does its own thing. So there'll be situations where people are killed by these systems and no one except the person who launched it will know whether they were whether it was autonomous or not. So no one will know whether that person's dignity was violated or not. Is that enough for the messiness of war? War is ugly and the rules we have are crude and imperfect. So maybe we're asking too much. So I may have to put that at the heart of it. Just one perspective on that.
So I think that comes to the end of the question. So how many semesters worth have we covered tonight?
All of it.
All of that. And all your books?
Yeah, that's right. You don't need to buy any of those that come in my house.
So with that, I wanted to kind of thank you, Dean, for kind of sharing what's been obviously many, many years of thinking through and kind of pondering these deep questions, as well as the experience of kind of dealing with and interacting with people actually have to make these decisions when it matters. So thank you for sharing the time and expertise. So if we could give the for people who are interested in more ethics, there is a talk here on Thursday evening at 7:30 on medical ethics with Dr. Russell Clark. So feel free to kind of come along for more ethics on Thursday evening. We will be looking to have a further Shepherd seminar towards the end of the year. This one, current plan is looking at trying to get some teachers, perhaps chaplains, talking about schooling in the current environment and what that looks like. Stay tuned. Hasn't been sorted, but we'll be trying to pull together a plan for that. And apart from that, I think Ben wanted to come and close the evening.
Yeah, well, Dean, thank you so much for an informative and interesting evening, and may God bless you, especially in your work training up our nation's future Defence Force officers in ethics and the just war tradition. Friends, to close this evening, I thought we might pray for our Defence Forces and also for the abolition of war. So would you please join me in prayer? Eternal God, the only source of peace, we pray for all who serve in the Defence Forces of this land. Give them courage and comfort in danger, patience in waiting, and discipline in the just use of force. Help us and them to seek for all people the freedom to serve you and each other in compassion and peace. We ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And God of the nations, whose sovereign rule brings justice and peace, have mercy on our broken and divided world. Make us a people zealous for peace, and hasten the day when nations shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither learn war anymore. Banish from them the spirit that makes for war, that all races and peoples may learn to live as members of one family, and in obedience to your law, through your Son, the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ our Lord.